Well, I should mention that as we were headed up to Big Bear, I forgot this part, it dawned on me. I thought, oh my goodness, what he's describing sounds an awful lot like what I'm trying to do in these little, images of God in the Old Testament, manuscript. A manuscript, of course, I never really got off the ground with, but again, it did flow eventually into this book, The Story of God. When I did doctoral work at Emory University, I did have occasion to read more about narrative theology. It was quite the rage back then. Not so much, not as much now. I mean, the phrase narrative theology doesn't get used quite as much. But you notice that in Amos Young's book, which is a very recent publication, he does not at all shy away from language and ideas very much like what I've been talking about in The Story of God. His is, again, much more recent book. That the Bible, to put it simply, the Bible is far more interested in bearing witness to or testifying to God as an actor within creation, within the history of the world, than it is with offering us kind of like abstract teachings about the nature of God. This is kind of a truism in biblical theology nowadays that, and this is actually also where my hesitation came about the phrase eternal truths. I had it picked on a little bit in class, and Ellis very legitimately kind of pushed back on me a little bit about eternal. By definition, means timeless or outside of or unrelated to time, and it seems to me that really Scripture does not function in that way. We could say it's partly kind of, we'll say, a Hebraic or Jewish mindset. I don't want to make it totally about that, but the Bible doesn't do speculative theology regarding God. It is testimony. It is preaching. It is proclamation. And one of the primary ways in which this is done is through story. Now, part of undoubtedly what motivated me in this regard, well, maybe I'll go on and say a little bit more. So I learned about narrative theology. I came to appreciate, I think, especially in grad studies, that I won't call it distinctively Jewish, but there is a typically Jewish approach to religious reflection that really thrives on the telling of stories. I don't want to reduce the Bible to just one story after another or one big story. It's definitely a much more complex library of writings than that. But there's still sort of this theology has taken on at least a narrative kind of logic that begins with creation. You could go like creation, humanity, humanity's fall, God's calling of Israel, the covenants with Israel, the prophets leading up to the time of Jesus. And so you get sort of this timeline that has a narrative character to it. The other aspect of narrative theology that I've mentioned already in The Story of God is that people who are sort of, we'll say, narrativists or narrative theorists argued that the use of story is one of the profound and very important ways that human beings try to sort of arrange or make sense of their lives, that we kind of see ourselves in terms of story. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So the idea of narrative theology is to see Scripture as offering a kind of narrative testimony to God and challenging us to understand ourselves within that larger narrative, as opposed to, let's say, having the story of me and trying to fit God into it. It's sort of the opposite of that. Well, after I finished my doctoral work, I started teaching at Northwest Nazarene College in Nampa, Idaho. And we'll just say that the first couple of years that I was teaching a course that I had taken as an undergrad, called Survey of Christian Thought. That was the required general education class of all students after they had taken Intro to Old Testament and Intro to New. And I taught this faithfully for a couple of years using the same textbook that had been used in my time as a student. That hadn't been that long before. I graduated from college in 1977 and returned to teach at Northwest Nazarene College in Nampa, Idaho in 1988. So 11 years later after my graduation. So the book that I was using, which was called Exploring Our Christian Faith, and was a compilation. It wasn't written by one person. It was edited by a couple of people. And various people wrote chapters in it, and they were all Nazarenes, I'm pretty sure, that wrote chapters. And the book was slightly different. It was a second edition by the time I came back to teach in 88. But it wasn't that good a book. It was very uneven. Some of the chapters I thought were very good and helpful. Some of them were pretty stinky. And but here I was sort of, I had inherited this book and I kind of plugged along with it. Unhappy with a good amount of it and always feeling like, oh, why do I have them read this chapter? Well, we kind of need to talk about this topic, but boy, this chapter is so awful. So after a couple of years of that, I finally hit this crisis point where I just remember like changing my book order at the last minute, saying, I can't use that book again. So I canceled my book order with the bookstore and frantically looked for something else. I don't even know if I have yes, I do. I went with, I don't know if I used 2 volumes back then. I don't know. I don't think so. So Sight Unseen, I had the book. I had not read it, called The Christian Story. See, this is the hot thing then. Subtitle, A Narrative Interpretation of Basic Christian Doctrine, by a very fine theologian, Gabriel Thacker. He's probably passed away by now. He was an American Baptist. The American Baptist Church is the, we'll call it the liberal wing of Baptists. It used to be called the Northern Baptist Church as opposed to the Southern Baptist. And you might be able to guess that this split between North and South happened basically at the time of the Civil War and the question of slavery. So now we're all on the side of the Northern Baptists who became the American Baptists, those galdang liberals, as my friend Sam Powell would say it often in jest. Well, Gabriel Thacker's book, The Christian Story, I used 1 year, that year having not read it. And it's a good book. The problem is, there are several problems. One, he was a seminary professor. So his implied audience was seminary students, not college sophomores. I had to spend a lot of time sort of doing remedial explanations and so on. Although I think he might have a glossary. No, I don't think, no glossary. I was the glossary for this class. And this is especially back, we didn't even have internet then. Or if we did it, we certainly wouldn't have been much help. I don't recall. Anyway, so one of the problems was it was a bit accelerated for undergrads. Also, nothing wrong with him being Baptist, but it meant that what they weren't getting was any kind of Wesleyan spin on things. And of course, it's a Nazarene school like Point Loma is, and part of the mission of the school is to communicate some bit of the Wesleyan tradition. So, I mean, one's books don't have to do that. I did that. I kind of supplied that element. There is a third thing, though, too. Besides it being more of a seminary-level text and no John Wesley, he talks a lot about the Christian story. He uses the language of story, but never gets around, or rarely gets around to actually talking about biblical narratives. And, of course, my book, I thought, well, gee whiz, if you're going to talk about the Christian story, let's actually talk about some of the stories. You can talk about this overarching story, but really the Bible itself is just packed with this kind of narratival sense about it. stories. I mean, gee whiz, from Genesis through Chronicles and all in Job, and the list goes on. Jesus' parables, of course, the Gospels themselves. So I thought I can write a book more aptly tuned to undergrads that brings in a lot of John Wesley and that actually will talk about biblical stories. And that leads us to the third chapter in a moment.